Hi, and welcome back. This is Bob Dickey here with part two of building a jewelry box. In the part one in our last session, we left off with the box all glued up and ready to go on to the next steps. And at this point, my next step is to put a profile along the top edge of the box. I've used a number of different router bits to do this, coves, OGs, bevels, what have you. And this one I've kind of come to like. I've had the bit for 10 years, so I don't even know what it's called, but it kind of behaves like a little miniature raised panel bit. And it works out quite nicely. So I set that up in the router table, and again, I'm going to typically do this at least in a couple of passes, so I make sure I don't overcut. So here's what the final profile looks like. I usually try and get that step on the lid with this particular bit as well, about 1/16 of an inch or a little bit more, and kind of split the thickness of the wood in terms of the flat versus the tapered area. But I just kind of like the way this kind of comes out. Next step is to take this over and start cutting the slots in the corners for the feathers. This is a jig that I put together. It's actually, I think, about my third. First one ended up in two pieces after a student managed to just keep on going right across the blade and out the other side. Anyway, I added on this one, I added the aluminum rail, a flip stop, and another stop on the end. One of the problems that I've had in the past, especially with larger boxes, is have them wiggle a little bit as they go across the blade, and that would widen the slot. So being able to basically hold the box at both sides as it's going through keeps it nice and rigid. So here we go, and just kind of watch the operation as it goes through. One of the things that you will notice, I think, is that I'm rotating the box counterclockwise, and that's just representative of how, with all my power tool operations that have multiple sides of the piece that I'm working on, that I try and have a repeatable process. So whether I'm turning clockwise, counterclockwise, or what have you, it's to do it the same all the time. And again, another lesson learned, when you get all done and you look and there's one slot on one corner that you missed because you didn't pay attention to what you were doing. So I rotate and I count 1, 2, 3, 4 before I go on to the next step.
It just feels like a
Okay, so here we've got the finished result, 4 slots in each of the corners, because I counted. Anyway, nice flat bottoms, which is what I really want to make sure that we get. So for years I did this with a 24 tooth ripping blade, an 1/8 inch curved 24 tooth ripping blade. Actually, from any manufacturer that I'm aware of has a flat top grind, so that blade works fine. Have to move a little bit slower because there's fewer teeth and you don't want to chip out, especially on some of the troublesome hardwoods. But they work fine as well. Since then, I've upgraded to that Forest #1 grind, 40 tooth, because I have so many different uses for it, and that really works out great, but definitely not essential. Okay, the next step is I want to create a little profile on the bottom of the box, and the reason I do it, maybe it's obvious from this picture, when you look at it, you got a rectangular box without feet or legs or a base, and it looks kind of clunky and it sits flat on top of the side table here, but a dresser. So I want to make it a little bit more aesthetic. So while I still have that flat top blade in the saw, I add a sacrificial fence and raise the blade about 1/4 of an inch. Then I make a couple of passes along that bottom edge of the box, and what I'm doing is just creating a 3/16 by 1/4 inch or thereabouts relief. And this is the result. If you could take a look and you see how much lighter that box look, it's even kind of like floating on the top, on the table, saw tabletop, and that's kind of the effect that I was trying to get. All right, so the next step is to fill in the slots in the corners with wood. And what's important here is to get a good fit on the feather stock and make sure it bottoms out in the groove when you apply the glue and insert it. And that's what that no blow hammer is there for. So if you got a drum sander, it's pretty easy to get a good thickness on the stock. If not, you rip it as close as possible, then sand it as necessary on a flat surface. And I recommend, if you're sanding the flat side, that you rotate it as you do so that you don't inadvertently add a taper. Something I learned a long time ago, if I have a piece that's just slightly too thick, that won't go in the slot, I can lay it down on a piece of iron, for example, just the anvil on the back of a metal vise, and wrap it with a hammer to compress it. Then put the glue on and get it into that slot, and what you'll find is that the moisture in the glue will cause that wood to swell back up and give you a nice snug fit. So it's an easy way to deal with something that's just a little bit oversized. Once the glue is dry, I need to at least rough cut the excess stock off of those feathers. And this is a simple jig I saw in Fine Woodworking here not that long ago, and it's kind of an example of why you get calluses on your hands and your forehead by slapping your head and saying, why hadn't I thought about that years ago? Anyway, it's easy to make, it works fast, and I love it now that I've started to use it. So here we are set up. I've got the jig moved over to where I'm going to leave about a 1/16 of an inch to be safe so I don't accidentally gouge the side of the box, which I have been known to do in the past. All right, so now we've moved to the kind of the moment of truth, which is cutting off that lid. There's so many ways of doing it. I think you've seen a lot of them if you follow the Box Builders Facebook group. But I use either that flat top grind blade from Forrest or the blade that's in the saw in this picture, which I've fallen in love with. It has a 1/16 inch kerf. It's from a company here in Wisconsin. It's a beautiful blade, but it's pricey. Regardless, I set the blade to a height just over the thickness of the stock. I just double check that by sliding the box up against the blade on the bottom side, raising the blade until it just sticks up a little bit. Okay, so I've cut through the two long sides of the box all the way through, and I apologize for this being a different box, but I forgot to photograph this step when I was doing the series. So my next step is to get an accurate reading of what the wall thickness actually is at that area where we're cutting off the lid, because remember we profiled the inside, so it's nowhere near as thick as it was down at the bottom when we set the saw blade. So the easiest way that I found to do that is to insert a thin piece of stock or another steel rule down into the cut that I just made, and take a second steel rule, come in from the side, push up against that first one, and measure the thickness. Usually it's going to be as I had said earlier in part one, around a half an inch, but I want to get a real accurate measurement. Then I'm going to lower the blade to about 1/32 less than that measurement that I took, and I use my Inker gauge for that, as I do in many of the things that I'm doing. So now we're going to go through and make that cut at the reduced depth in the two short sides. So why did I hold it up in the air after making that first cut? That is actually just to hold it up to the light and look and see what thickness I had on that actual web, where I didn't want to cut all the way through, but I wanted to get as close as I could. So I was looking, as I said, for about a 1/32 web in there. Looked okay, so I flipped it over and I did the other side. So now, if you get it just right, the rest of the process goes pretty easily. So you can see it came out pretty well. I'm looking for any glue squeeze out that's in there. Doesn't look like I have any, which is great. It's hard to clean out. So pretty happy with the way that came out. Also happy with the miters. They stayed well, closed up very well. So that takes us to moving into the area where we've got to start working on the inside and the trays and things like that, which is going to happen in part 3. And that'll take a little while, folks, because I got some time off coming up and I got to shoot some more pictures before I get there. But thanks for checking me out and checking this video out, and I hope it's helpful. Take care.